How long were the Israelites in Egypt? Now, this seems like a cut and dry question, right? Just go to the book of Exodus and it should tell us. However, mathematically, it doesn't seem to add up. And then when we go to Paul's writings, it also doesn't seem to add up. It seems to have a different definition of the 430 years. Now, we will get popular movies that will say and do the famous rendition of either the Passover story or the slaves in Egypt as them being in Egypt for over 400 years. But were they really? So today, let's take a deeper dive and actually discuss how long were the Israelites in Egypt. So in Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 and 41, it says this. Now, the time that the sons of Israel had lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of the 430 years, on this very day, all the multitudes of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt. Now, that seems pretty cut and dry. However, in the book of Galatians, Paul says this. Now, the promise were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as one would be inferring to many, but rather as in referring to one, and to your seed, that is Christ. What I am saying is this: the law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God as to nullify the promise. So now it seems that Paul is implying that the 430 years that seems to be mentioned in the book of Exodus was from the giving of the law, not how long they were in Egypt. So is this a contradiction? I don't think it is, but let's take a deeper look into this. Now, the Torah says that, quote, at the end of the 430 years to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. 430 years from what very day? Exodus 12:40 states that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years. Now, Rashi, the famous Rabbi Shlomo, uses the genealogy fragment to prove that the children of Israel did not sojourn in Egypt for 400 years. And this is what Rashi says concerning Exodus chapter 6, verse 16. Through this reckoning of the years of Kohath and Amram, we learn about the 430-year sojourn of the children of Israel mentioned in the scriptures in Genesis 15:13. And we're going to return there in a second. This proves that the 430 sojourn did not take place only in Egypt, but rather the 400-year period started from the day Isaac was born. For Kohath was among those who went down to Egypt. Add all Kohath's 133 years and the 137 years of Amram and the 80 years of Moses until the Exodus, you will not find them to be 430 years. One must also take in consideration the fact that many of the years of the sons overlap the years of the father. Now, what is he talking about right here? So here, the following table that's right down below us, it illustrates Rashi's problem with the text. Even if the full ages of the fathers and the sons were added up, they still fall 50 years short of 400. Additionally, Kohath could not have been 33 years old the year that Amram was born, and Amram could not have been 137 years old when Moses was born. Instead, many of the years of the sons overlap the years of the father. So this is what they're talking about. Out of these, Kohath entered Egypt, and then Moses was 80 years old at the time, right? So if we start with Kohath, 133 plus 137, and Moses at 80, we get 350 years. What this is implying as a timeline is if Kohath lived 133 years, and at 133, had relations with his wife, and right when Amram was born, he died, right? Very unlikely, but let's just go with that for a second. So the whole 133 years, now we have a 137. Amram lives out his time, and when he's 137, impregnates his wife. When his wife gives birth, he dies, and then Moses starts on. Even if we were to spread it out like that, we would only get 350 years. There's 550 years missing from the 400, right? So what Rashi is saying is, you're not even going to go that far. Kohath probably had Amram when he was much younger. And then same with Amram with Moses. He's going to have him much younger. The timeline for a more realistic timeline would be anywhere between like 200 and 250, not 400. And even again, it would be impossible. So that's what Rabbi Shlomo is pointing out here. Now, the Lord appeared to Abraham and told him that his seed would be strangers in the land not theirs for 400 years. This seems to imply that the exile of Egypt would last around 400 years. But in Exodus 12:40, the Torah says the children of Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years. So we kind of have two different numbers right here. So the first one of the 400 that's mentioned in Egypt is Genesis 15:14, but the 430, the more specific year in Egypt, is mentioned in Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. Now, the rabbis looked at this 30-year discrepancy and proposed a solution. And this is from Genesis Rabbah, the Midrash, 44:18, which says, this means that they will remain until 400 years have passed after seed shall be granted to you. Rabbi Yudan said, the condition of being strangers is servitude and afflicted in a land not theirs was to last 400 years, which was decreed term. Okay. Again, that's from the Midrash. So, just as in English, the Hebrew word for seed, or the Hebrew is zerah, can indicate a singular seed, or the plural of many seed. The rabbinic interpretation of the passage explains that God promised Abraham that his seed, plural, would inherit the land of Canaan 400 years after he had born a seed, singular, namely Isaac. In other words, his seed, the children of Israel, will come out from oppression and inherit Canaan 400 years after the birth of his seed, Isaac. The counting of the 400 years did not start until the birth of Abraham's seed, Isaac. So Rashi explains that the oppression of Abraham's seed happened not only in Egypt, rather it was the quote, the condition of being strangers and afflicted in a land not theirs, which was to last 400 years. The land that is not theirs refers to Canaan. Isaac lived as a stranger in a land that did not belong to him. His descendants, or seed, went down into Egypt, where the Egyptians enslaved and oppressed them until 400 years have passed since the birth of Isaac. Then they came out of many possessions. Now, the ambiguity of the word seed allowed the sages to account for the 30-year discrepancy between the two passages. The rabbis simply said, God made the promise to Abraham 30 years before Isaac was born. Therefore, the exodus from Egypt took place exactly 400 years after Isaac was born, but 430 years after God made the covenant with Abraham. And also, according to Exodus 12:41, the Exodus occurred 430 years later on that very day. That means that the first day of Passover, or Nisan 15, coincides with the anniversary of the very day that God made the covenant with Abraham. Therefore, God made the covenant with Abraham on Passover. 30 years later, Isaac was born on Passover. Now, this explanation also solves the problem about the duration of the sojourn in Egypt. Sarah gave birth to Isaac 30 years after God made the covenantal promise to Abraham. 60 years later, Isaac's wife gave birth to Jacob. Jacob was 130 years old when he and his sons entered Egypt. So you take the 30 plus the 60 plus the 130, and you get 220. Subtract the 220 from the 430 reported in Exodus 12:41, and it leaves 210 years of the total sojourn in Egypt. Subtract the 80 years of Moses' life, and that only leaves only 130 years between Moses and his grandfather Kohath. Still a large number, but far more reasonable than the 330 years necessarily otherwise. Now, hence the sages overturned the literal meaning of the 430 years found in Exodus 12 and the 400 years in Egypt predicted in Genesis 15 in favor 430 years from the day God made the covenant with Abraham and 400 years from the birth of Isaac, Abraham's singular seed. This is not what the Torah literally says, but this is how the rabbis interpret it. Now, one can arrive at the solution only through rabbinic tradition and interpretation, which is what Paul did in Galatians 3:15-17. And this is what it says. Brethren, I speak in terms of human relations. Even though it is only a man's covenant, yet when it was ratified, no one has set it aside or adds conditions to it. Now the promises were spoke to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to his seeds, as referring to many, but to referring to one, and to your seed, that is the Messiah. Now, notice how Paul played the singular / plural discrepancy with the word seed, much as the sages did. The rabbis used the ambiguity to apply the 400-year promise in Galatians 15 to the birth of Isaac, the singular seed of Abraham. Paul said that all the nations will be blessed in Messiah, the singular seed of Abraham. According to Paul's rabbinic style reading in the Torah, God made the promise to Abraham and to his seed, i.e., the Messiah. That is not literally what the Torah means. But Paul makes a midrash on the text, just like the sages did with Isaac as Abraham's seed in Paul's interpretation. Yeshua is the seed of Abraham. Also notice what Paul stated, the Torah came 430 years after God made the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15. Paul followed the rabbinic interpretation of Exodus 12:41. Now, finally, he pointed out that the giving of the Torah, which defines Jewish identity and the nation of Israel, cannot annually be a covenant previously held by God. And this is what he says in Galatians 3:17-18. The Torah, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God as to nullify the promise. For if the inheritance is based on the Torah, it is no longer based on the promise. But God has granted it to Abraham by means of the promise. Paul says that the commandments of the Torah, which deny Levitical status, came 430 years after God had already promised to bless the nations in Abraham's seed, the Messiah. Therefore, the Gentile nations need not come under the obligations of Jewish identity under the law in order to receive the promised blessing in Abraham's seed, the Messiah. This simple logic also reveals a culinary truth. Just as Sinai covenant cannot overturn or nullify the Abrahamic covenant, neither can the new covenant overturn or nullify the Sinai covenant. Instead, one covenant builds on another. They must all work together. Now, in the case, the 430 years mentioned in Exodus 12:40-41 referred to the length of time since Abraham received the 400-year promise of Genesis 15:13. The 30-year discrepancy represents the time that eclipsed between the giving of the promise of Genesis 15:13 and the birth of Isaac, Abraham's seed. Paul's explanation on the passage agrees with Rashi. And again, Galatians 3:16-17. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. What I am saying is this: the Torah, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God as to nullify the promise. And when we look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 in the Septuagint and in the Samaritan Pentateuch, it clarifies the statement by saying, and the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, was 430 years. And the Samaritan Pentateuch, now the sojourning of the children of Israel and their fathers, which they had dwelt in the land of Canaan and in Egypt, for 430 years. So that's simply it right there. And we knew that Paul used the Septuagint to look at it. So just as the Masoretic text says, as they dwelled in the land of Egypt, it was implying to meant also Canaan. I hope you enjoyed this teaching. Please like, share, subscribe, guys, and I will see you on the next one. Shalom.